The most dangerous building in any frontier town was the one with the cross on top. The smell inside told you what Hollywood never did. Oak smoke from the iron stove, 50 bodies pressed close in wet wool, and something else underneath. Something sweet and wrong that settles at the back of your throat. Every Western film shows you white clapboard walls and morning light and a congregation singing in peace. In a real frontier church, the hymn started, and somewhere in the middle of it, someone coughed. The frontier church was not a refuge. It was the most efficient disease machine in the American West. By the 1870s, the Protestant church was the center of civic life in almost every frontier town in America. It was built before the school, sometimes before the saloon. A congregation of 30 or 40 families met weekly, shared news, organized relief for neighbors whose crops had failed, and arranged marriages for their children. The circuit rider, the minister who traveled a fixed route through dozens of settlements and sometimes covered 300 miles in a single circuit, was often the only man in the territory with any formal education. What most accounts of the frontier miss, that same church was also the closest thing most towns had to a hospital. Injured travelers were laid in the pews to recover. Women in labor were carried there when the sod houses were too cold. The church stove provided the only sustained heat in the settlement that could be kept through a winter night. Families brought their most desperate cases there because the church was the only building large enough, warm enough, and staffed enough to help. That is the same building, the same pews, the same sealed walls, the same stove pulling cold air in and turning it into warm air that circulated through the room. If you lived in a frontier town in the 1880s, the church was the one place you were expected to appear every week, no matter what was happening at home. The disease most commonly carried into that building was diphtheria, known then as the strangling angel of children. Diphtheria spread through respiratory droplets expelled by coughing, by singing, by the simple act of speaking close to another person. In a sealed church in January, with 50 people pressed onto wooden pews and one iron stove burning all morning, those droplets did not disperse. They circulated. The stove pulled air from one side of the room and pushed it to the other. The ceiling was low. The windows were shut. The congregation had been sitting together for 2 hours. The bacteria survived on hard surfaces for hours. The pew back your hand rested on. The hymnal passed row to row. The shared communion cup, a single metal vessel that moved from mouth to mouth along every pew in the building. A person infected with diphtheria could be contagious before developing any visible symptoms. They would feel fine. They would arrive Sunday morning, sing the opening hymn, share the communion cup, and pass the piece to the family in the adjacent row. 3 days later, when the first sore throat appeared, nobody in the congregation would connect it to Sunday morning. In a building designed to bring people together, contagion moved faster than faith. By 1880, enough physicians had published enough reports naming the shared communion cup as a disease vector that the medical literature on the subject was substantial. The reports circulated. The cup stayed in the pews for another 20 years. Was that faith or stubbornness? Tell me in the comments. Now consider what happened when someone died. A death from diphtheria meant a funeral in the church. It also meant 2 or 3 days of visitation before it, neighbors coming to sit with the grieving family, to bring food, to pray in the same rooms where the sick child had spent their final weeks. The family members who had been nursing the child were still contagious. The community gathered as an act of love. They filed into the pews, 30 or 40 families, some already exposed, some not yet. They sat in a sealed building for an hour. They breathed the same air. They went home. The incubation period for diphtheria was 2 weeks. In 2 weeks, you would know which families at that funeral had been infected. Then there would be another funeral. The same community would gather. The same air would move through the same sealed room. In some frontier counties, a single initial case escalated through church gatherings into outbreaks that killed a dozen families before the winter was over. The mechanism was the gathering. The gathering was the church. And nobody in the 1880s had the authority to tell the frontier church to stop. The people living this did not understand the pattern. They were following the only social protocol they knew. You went to church on Sunday. You attended when a neighbor died. You showed up because that was what community required. Every act of solidarity was also an act of transmission. The frontier church has been remembered as a sanctuary. That memory belongs to the people who walked out of it. The ones who left feet first did not write the history of the building that killed them. Step into Central City, Nebraska in the autumn of 1882. The church smells like every church on the frontier. Sawdust floor, oil lamp smoke, the cold pressing under the door even when the stove is running. The population is small. The doctor who serves all of Merritt County is a man everyone calls Doc Gone. Doc Gone had arrived in Central City around 1875, 7 years before the winter that would define his practice. He was the sole physician for the entire county, responsible for every birth, every injury, and every epidemic that came through the territory. In October of 1882, the first child in Central City died of diphtheria. You already know the family. They sat 3 rows ahead of you in church. Their daughter had been coughing for a week before anyone thought to worry. By March of 1883, 15 children were dead. The youngest was 1 month old. The oldest was 13 years old. Doc Gone treated every case. He could save almost none of them because diphtheria in 1882 had no effective treatment beyond supportive care. What he could not do was stop the congregation from gathering each Sunday. What he could not do was close the church for a funeral. What he could not do in a frontier county with no functioning public health authority and no quarantine law was tell the families to stay home. You step into that church on a Sunday morning in February of 1883. You already know 2 families that have buried a child. The pews are full around you. There is nowhere else to go. And then the cup comes down the row. 1 metal cup. You have held it every Sunday since you were old enough to take communion. You have never thought about what it is. You take the rim in your fingers, tip it to your lips, and pass it left. The person beside you does the same. The cup travels the length of the pew, then the next, then the next. The shared communion cup was the standard in Protestant churches across the American frontier. 1 vessel, 1 congregation, every week. It traveled from the lips of the consumptive in the 3rd row to the healthy child in the 4th. From the man with the persistent winter cough in the back to the woman in the 2nd pew who would not feel the fever for another 10 days. In March of 1882, Robert Koch presented his identification of the tuberculosis bacillus before the Berlin Physiological Society. The announcement made international news. Germ theory was not a new idea. Physicians had been publishing on airborne and surface transmission for more than a decade before that. The information existed. The mechanism was understood. The cup kept moving. Individual communion cups began appearing in American Protestant churches in the 1890s, introduced specifically because physicians had spent years demanding it. A physician named Charles Foote introduced them to his congregation in Rochester, New York, in 1894, citing germ theory directly in his argument to the church council. Congregations in rural Kansas and Nebraska were still debating the change in 1903. The cup was sacred. The ritual was old. The science had been available for 30 years. You pass it to your left. The next person drinks. The cup continues down the row. The churches that gathered to save souls were killing the bodies that carried them. The West built its communities the way it built everything else: fast, practical, and without asking who would die for it. The church, the saloon, the army fort, the frontier school, each one a gathering place, each one a silent engine of contagion that no one thought to close. If that is the kind of history you want to understand, subscribe. There is more coming. None of this diminishes what those people were. The families who filled those pews had no framework for understanding what was moving through the air around them. They were doing everything right by every standard available to them. They gathered because isolation kills the spirit the same way diphtheria kills the airway. They showed up for funerals because that is how communities survive in places where the nearest city is 3 days away. When the epidemics came, these congregations did not scatter. They organized. Women brought food. Men dug graves in frozen ground. Families took in the children of parents who had died. The same church building that carried disease from family to family was also the structure that held the grief, absorbed the loss, and gave the survivors a reason to come back the following Sunday. They were not naive. They were doing what human beings do under impossible pressure. The church door still opened every Sunday. The stove still burned. The pews still filled. And they held. The door's still open. The stove is still burning. The smell of oak smoke and wet wool still fills the air when you step inside on a Sunday morning in 1882. The hymn begins. 40 voices rise together in the cold. And somewhere in the third row, a man clears his throat. Nobody looks up. The cup is already moving down the row.